everybody. So I am here to begin a tutorial series on how to knit a pair of socks using the magic loop method. So what I've got here is one little sock that I've knit through, and this is the pair of socks that we're going to be knitting through this series. So I've got one knit up already just so you can see what it is that we're doing. So I've just got a little vanilla shorty sock here, and this sock is knit cuff down. So we've got a 2x2 rib and then a short little leg. We've got a heel flap, a turn, gusset decreases, the foot, and then the toe. So what we're going to be doing today in the first video is I'm just going to quickly chat to you in general about the magic loop method and tell you what yarn we're going to be using, or what I'm going to be using rather. And then we're going to cast on, and then I'm going to show you the first round of the rib, and then you can go away and knit through your rib. You can use whatever fingering weight yarn you want to. You will need one skein of fingering weight yarn. I'm using this lovely new sock yarn from Malabrigo. It's called Malabrigo Ultimate Sock, and it's a 75-25 fingering weight yarn, and this colourway is Rosalinda, and it's really lovely. I really like how it's knit up. It's all these sort of pinks and peaches and lilacs. So that's the yarn I'm going to be using, but you can use any fingering weight yarn that your heart desires. So I'm going to move this sock now out of the way. So what we're going to be needing is obviously first of all our needle for knitting magic loop. Now what you will need to knit the magic loop method is one long circular needle. This one that I've got is 32 inches, or that's 80 centimetres, and it doesn't matter what brand you use. I mean, you may have a preference of a brand. The one that I'm using is an Addy. The pattern that I've written up that will be attached to this video for you to work your way through, it does recommend in that pattern that you use a 2.25mm, which is my sort of standard go-to size for socks, but I'm actually using a 2.5mm just for this tutorial, just so that everything's a little bit clearer to see. But obviously you use whatever size you would normally use to get the gauge that I've stated. So mine is an Addy. I really like these needles. It's a fixed circular. Most needles I think that you would use to knit magic loop will be a fixed circular, but I have in the past used Chowgu mini twists, which are interchangeable. I've stopped using those recently only because I love them. But the reason I stopped using the interchangeables is because the cable on the mini twists is really, really thin. And I realised that was causing me to have like a line of tight stitches when I knit magic loop. So I've actually stopped using those at the moment. And I've gone back to Addies, which I really like. But you choose whatever brand of needle is your preference, and I always use this length for knitting magic loop. This is, like I said, it's 32 inches or 80 centimetres. I know some people prefer a longer length of cable, and I've even seen some people knit magic loop using a 24-inch, which I wouldn't recommend that, certainly not for starting off, because I just think that's too short of a cable really. So you want 80 centimetre, whatever size, either 2.25 or 2.5 in my case millimetre circular needle. So we're going to start by casting on. So we're going to use long tail cast on. Now I have done a tutorial for long tail cast on, so if you're unsure about how to do it, then you can always go back and watch that, you know, if you want to sort of practice a little bit. But I imagine that lots of you will already be familiar with long tail cast on, so I'm just going to go ahead and cast on my stitches. So I'm knitting the medium size, which is 64 stitches. So we are going to cast on all of our stitches onto one needle, or one needle tip I should say. We've only got one needle because that's how magic loop works. So I'm just going to cast on 64 stitches using long tail cast on. Okay, so I've got all 64 stitches. Sorry, I was casting on that way, I turned it around just to count them. I've got all 64 stitches cast on here. So before we sort of join in the round, I'm just going to trim my long tail. It doesn't need to be quite that long. So just trim that. So now what I'm going to do is just turn my needle, and I'm now going to scoot all of my stitches onto the cable, onto the centre bit of the cable, like that. Because now what we need to do is we need to split these stitches in half. Because the way that Magic Loop works is we will have half of our stitches on one needle and the other half will be on the other needle. So the first thing I need to do is divide them into two. So I've got 64 here, so I need to count 32 stitches, and that will be my centre point. 32, it's right there. And then what we do is we bend the cable at that point there, so pinch it and then pull. So that means now I've got half and half on each side of the cable and on each needle. So now just grab hold of your stitches like that and then push your needles back on the stitches. Like that. And now you can see it's all kind of a bit twisty and not quite right. So what you need to do is make sure that all of these kind of pearl bump stitchy side here, pearl bump stitchy side, the little pearl bumps here, they all want to be like on the inside of your needle. So just sort of rearrange it so that all of those pearl bumps are on the inside. And then if you look on the outside, we've got that lovely sort of cast on edge here, which will be the outside or the right side of our sock. So that's our stitches split. So now what we need to do is join in the round. Because at the moment it's joined down here, you can see, because that's where our stitches divided, but we're not joined here. So we need to join in the round. Now, the simplest form of doing that is literally just to start knitting on this front needle. However, I've discovered over the years of sock knitting that if you do that, you can end up with like a little jog, because what happens when we're knitting the round is we knit in a spiral. We don't knit in like a flat circle, if you know what I mean. It's on the spiral. So you will end up with a little jog, and you can get a bit of a gap as well. So I use a little technique now that completely eliminates that gap and also pretty much eliminates the jog. So I am going to show you that. So what we need to do now is turn our needles back to the position of where we were casting on that last stitch here, and we need to cast on one more stitch, and I'm going to cast it on to what is now my back needle here. So just cast on one more stitch using long tail onto that back needle. Okay, and then pull both ends of the yarn sort of back and forth like that to tighten everything up. Now turn back, because this is now how we're going to start knitting. But before you do that, grab both ends of the yarn here, both sort of the tail end and the working end, bring them up between your needles and over the back. Okay, and now we're ready to start knitting, because what I've effectively done by casting on that extra stitch here is that has joined in the round before we've even started. So that to me what makes this super neat. So grab your working yarn, make sure you're not knitting with your tail end, an easy thing to do. And the first thing we're going to do is that extra stitch, I'm going to knit it together with the first stitch on my needle. And that is going to eliminate that extra stitch and make that join super neat. So I'm going to pull out my back needle. This is how Magic Loop works. Pull out your back needle, and I'm going to knit across my front needle. So pop it through both of those stitches, the extra one and your first stitch. Grab your working yarn. It will look a bit loosey-goosey at the moment, but that's fine, it'll tighten up. Just knit those two together, and that's our first stitch knitted. So I'm going to do a knit 2 purl 2 rib, so we can now just work across this front needle in knit 2 purl 2. Okay, so we're at the end now, the last 2 purl stitches. Okay, so now what we're going to do is turn to work the other side. So you can effectively drop that needle there, turn your work. Okay, Now, before we start knitting on the front, what is now the front side, I'm going to sort out this tail here. Can you see how at the moment it's sort of coming up here? It's not quite in the right position, so what I'm going to do is just pull it out like that, and now pop it back down the middle. It just gets itself a little twisted with that little method that I use, so I just find that this works a treat. So I've pulled it down the middle, and can you see now this gap? So watch what happens when I pull that tail end. You see how it's completely closed up? And you can do that even more once you've knit a few rounds. And it's in exactly the right position now for weaving in when we're finished. Okay, so we've knit across that first needle, and now what we need to do is push these stitches that we haven't yet worked back on to your needle like that. So at this stage now we've got both sets of stitches back on our needles, and now we can work across this set of stitches on the front. So before we do that, this yarn always needs to be at the back because we're knitting this first stitch. So I'm going to, as I did before, pull out the back needle, bring that round, and then I can knit across this second needle with my knit 2 purl 2. So I will work to the end of this needle, and then I'll see you at the end of the round. And we've completed our first round of magic loop knitting. So turn, and then push these stitches back on to the needle, ready to start round 2. So before we start working our way down the rib, we'll just have a little look. So always bring your working yarn to the back because we're knitting that first stitch. So that tail end now, you can just sort of give it a little tug and it just neatens up that point, and we'll look at that more closely once we've finished the rib. I can show you just how neat that is. But we've now completed one round. So using that method of pulling out the back needle, knitting on the front needle, just as we did for that round, you can now go ahead and complete your rib. So I did 12 rounds because it's just a little shorty sock. If you wanted to do a longer sock, you know, you can entirely do that. You could do a longer rib and you can do a longer leg. But I'm just going to do a little short cuff and a little short leg. So just 12 rounds. So work through your ribbing, and then I'll see you back in the next video when we're going to have a look at what we've done and then start in on the leg. So I'll see you back soon.